Okay.
It's April 23rd, 2008, and we're at the home of Frank Cirill. Frank is currently President Emeritus of Save the American River Association, fondly called SARA. And Frank has also served 2 terms in the past as President of the organization, and is fast approaching his 40th year of service, as I recall. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And Frank, if maybe you could take us back to an earlier period of time and prior to coming on board with SARA, and kind of bring us up to date how you found SARA and what's happened in those years, and especially those years that led up to the formation of the Parkway, and then from that point on, of course.
Well, I'll just make a few comments regarding what happened, let's say, before I came to Sacramento in 1950, May of 1950. I just go back a few years to when I graduated from high school and went into the Merchant Marine. At that time, it was February the 1st, I think, of 1942, and the principal of our high school said, anybody who wants to join the armed services and have a passing grade, I'll give a diploma. So I had a passing grade, went in at noon and got my diploma, and then the following week was in training for the maritime service. Well, I served as a combat Merchant Marine veteran all during World War II. And then I also served during the Marshall Plan period, which was the period after World War II, when in order to keep the world from going communist, we fed the world and also resupplied the industry and so forth. So anyway, at a point in time, I'd say, I think it was 1949, late 1949, I decided that I was living in Long Beach at the time, which is a seaport. And the temptation was too great to go back to sea. I had my chief mate's license and could have sat for a master's license. And I decided that I should get away from a seaport, or else I would be back on a ship again, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to end in my life looking at the world through a porthole. I'd had enough of that. So anyway, I remember I had passed through Sacramento one time on the train and spent a day here. Just drove around, took a bus and so forth, and I remember it being a nice city and the capital of the state of California. So I decided at that time that I would come to Sacramento because it had 2 rivers, which I'm always interested in water, whether it's the ocean, lakes, or rivers, and decided that I would come up here and make this my home and seek a second career, a land career here in Sacramento. So I remember in May of 1950, Highway 99 at that time was Stockton Boulevard. I came in, it was very hot, and I came up and then I turned down Alhambra and went to Capitol, and just a little below Capitol on Folsom, there was the Old Tavern, which I believe is now Beavis. And I went in there and I had a couple of beers, and then I had, and in those days when you were in a new community, you didn't stay in a hotel, you went to a boarding house. So I found the boarding house, and then eventually made my way from there. And then, because I knew mathematics, having been a navigator on board merchant vessels, I entered into the construction business. That was the closest thing that I could think of, because then I became an estimator and so forth. So that's how I settled in Sacramento from May of 1950. Well, then during the decade, I got myself established in the construction industry. Went to work for a very large construction firm. We built many of the office buildings downtown, as well as many homes. It was called Lawrence Construction. Then I became interested in fly fishing, and also in the river. And at that time, I think I joined SARA as a member in about 64 or 65. Then I stayed on for a while. Then I became director of SARA in 1968. At the same time, I was fly fishing, and I became interested in the California Fly Fishermen's Unlimited. It's now Fishers Unlimited. And I met Nick Bresci there. We did a little fishing. And then we decided that because there wasn't enough water in the river, that we would do something to attempt to get more water in the river. So at that time, he and I formed under the aegis of the California Fly Fishers Unlimited, we formed a committee, an ad hoc committee, with a very long title called the Committee for a Guaranteed Minimum Flow on the Lower American River. And at that time, the Bureau and the Corps were only required to release 250 to 500 cubic feet per second down the river. And we were attempting to get more. Well, we worked, we developed an alliance with various fishing clubs and also SARA, and we attempted to get more, and if my memory serves me right, we did get the state, which did not have complete control over the flows, to increase it, and I think it was around 1,250 cubic feet. Then from that point on, I became more involved in SARA. I became involved in various issues, and then I was asked by Supervisor Sheedy at that time to become a park commissioner, which I did, and I was a park commissioner from 1973, I believe, to 1978. And by that time, my wife and I got married, 1960, and I've been living in River Park ever since, for about 43 years in River Park. But my activities involving SARA kept growing, and I became involved more in the land issues of SARA. We had some people who were fishery biologists and knew more about the natural aspects of the river than I, but I seemed to be attracted to the land issues relating to SARA, and so I became kind of a specialist in that, and that kept evolving, and there were several key, or I shouldn't say key, but significant efforts to impact the parkway during the course, let's say, of these 20 or 30 years that I became involved in the land issue. I remember one was, and usually these particular efforts, let's say, usually lasted 2 or 3 years. And then we either won them or we'd lose them, and sometimes we had to go to court to win them. But one was the then executive director of Cal Expo, a fellow by the name of Joe Burkett. He and a judge who was very interested in golfing, they tried to develop a 40-acre parking lot near Cal Expo in the floodplain, and that was a period that for one whole year, I operated out of the Friends of the River, and Charlie Casey was involved at that time. Ron Stork was also, but Charlie Casey was the person that I was primarily working with.
What time period was this, Frank?
This would be, let me see here, if I got some information here.
So this was the Bushy Lake.
I got so many dates. This would be probably, I think, in the early 90s.
Okay.
In about the early 90s. And they were really using they actually wanted to change the parkway plan, is what they were trying to do, with the idea that if they got the 40-acre parking lot, they would also, and supposedly the parking lot was going to be used by Cal Expo for surplus parking, but that was not the truth. The idea was that once they built the parking lot in the floodplain, they would also build a golf course that had been, that's been started at one time, and actually the greens were in. And I forget who the director of Cal Expo was at that time, but we used to call him the drugstore cowboy because he always...
Kirk Breed.
Kurt Breed.
Right.
And what he actually did was he made seats on the levee and had pole fields and so forth, and would ride his horse around. He treated it as a private ranch practically. Well, that was before this happened. Then when Joe Burkett came on, at that time the Cal Expo was more in control of the commission, of the Cal Expo Commission, but this effort was put forward, and with the idea of having another golf course. That's really what they wanted. So I spent one whole summer along with Charlie Casey using Friends of the Rivers headquarters, and I would go down and lobby each legislator. Went through the Assembly, the Senate, with the attempt to defeat that effort. And at that time, Leroy Green, who was the senator at that time, he was the point person for Cal Expo. And I remember he was a senior senator, and it was very, very difficult to go up against the senior senator. This was in his turf, and the other legislators didn't want to infringe on his turf. So it breezed through the Senate very easily. Then it got to the Assembly, and fortunately Dusty Arias was the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, and he was more sympathetic to keeping the parkway natural. And fortunately, he delayed it in committee, to the point that the bill was defeated. It was actually inactive, and it was supposed to be started again reenacted, let's say, by Senator Green the following year. So anyway, I had a very good friend who at that time was a reporter for the Capitol staff of the Bee. And he was very, very clever, and he said, and now Leroy Green had said, I'm going to reenact this bill the following year. By that time, the Cal Expo Commission had changed, and they weren't as sympathetic and supportive of having a golf course. And I remember the head of the commission at that time was a lobbyist for the oil industry. So anyway, we went up and saw him. He said, well, if you can convince Leroy to drop this bill, we'll go along with it. So this good friend of mine did a very clever thing. He says, Frank, he said, what you ought to do is write a letter to Leroy Green and say that you've been along, say that you're in his district and you have supported him all the time. But however, the philosophy of the parkway differs, and you would like him to reconsider. So I wrote that letter, and about 3 weeks later I got a call from his chief of staff, invited me to be at Leroy Green's table at the Harry Truman Democratic Club. They have a dinner every year. He was very friendly with me, and it dropped. So that was a very unusual way that we won. I think he realized that because the commission, the Cal Expo Commission, was no longer supportive, that it wouldn't go through. So that took about a year and a half. I just mentioned it within, let's say, 3 or 4 minutes, but it did take that amount of time.
But it's considered a significant victory.
It was a significant victory because it was the first time that we had a situation where it was very visible. It was 40 acres in the parkway, and we had the government, the senior senator supporting it. And in that particular instant, we did because it was, uh, it wasn't a situation where we get a lot of people involved and go down to the Assembly or the Senate. That didn't seem to be working. Oh, and I might mention that was the first time that I got Alan Wade involved. He went down with me and spoke, you know. So that was significant because he was beginning to come aboard, and I realized that now here was the possibility, because at that time I was thinking of a successor to my being the president of SARA. So that was his first experience, and he got a very good experience. So you're right, that was a significant win. We did stop it, and we got a lot of notoriety out of it. And I remember the Sacramento News and Review just loved it. They took pictures of me down there at Bushy Lake and so forth, and I remember one picture that they took, there just happened to be a deer coming in the background. It was a great photo op.
Yeah.
So SARA, that did put SARA in the spotlight. So that was significant, and it was significant that also Alan Wade came in and so forth.
The other significant one, and I really would love to hear from day one, the 20-year battle for the taking of water from the Folsom South Canal, and how that came about, and then how SARA inserted ourselves and became our battle, and then of course others as well. I think that's really
that was a significant battle also. However, that was more of a team effort, let's say. It was a team effort by Felix Smith, Jim Jones, Ron Stork, and others. It was spread out. The fight was spread out amongst various organizations. SARA was a part of it, and a very important part of it. In that particular issue, I wasn't as active as I've been in the others, and I think the reason why was because there were these other fights going on at the same time. Because you have to remember, the East Bay Mud Battle, that started in about early 70s and went on to 89. Well, while that was going on, I was fighting all these other battles, and so the East Bay Mud Battle, I think, was primarily fought by the likes of Jim Jones and Felix Smith and Ron Stork and those. So we always have to remember that there just wasn't one issue going on at the time. There were quite a few. And there again, being that I was more involved in the land issues, and that was my specialty, I put in the majority of my time there. So, excuse me while that's a hay fever. So what I'll do is I'll bring out some significant battles that I personally was. They either were when I was president, or shortly before, or shortly after. There was a situation that occurred at Lake Natoma. Now, Lake Natoma isn't the American River Parkway, but it's part of it. And I remember it happened, I think about 80, let's see if okay, I got this is a letter dated May 10th, 1988. So it started about 1985, about 3 years before that time. I got a call, and I was not president of SARA at that time. That was before I became president in 1990. I got a call from Charlie Willard, and Charlie was a employee of the State Parks Department. He was a avid kayaker, and he used the lake a lot. And he had just heard about me being in SARA, and somebody had suggested that he call me. And at that time, there was a very interesting thing happening up at Lake Natoma. There was a fella, his name was Myers. He he was attempting, and this was at the time when, during the Duke Majan's administration, when Duke Majan was trying to concessionaire off as much parkland as he could. And whenever somebody, some group or some individual came to him, particularly if they were part of the Republican administration, he would accede to maybe being in favor of a certain portion of the parkland being concessionaired off to an individual or a group. Well, in this particular instance, there was a guy by the name of Bud Myers. He actually worked for one of the water districts in the, maybe in El Dorado County. And it turned out that he, later on I found out that he had his hand in the till and he was fired, and he came down here, and he and an electrical contractor in Folsom decided that what they were going to do is attempt to get the concession to operate all of Nimbus Flat, the 75 acres just upstream from the CSUS Aquatic Center. Their plan was to have a tour boat on the lake. It was to go from some commercial property that the subcontractor owned right in the city of Folsom, right near the lake, or I should say on the river near Folsom. Anyway, it was going to be that, and then there was going to be a trailer park, overnight trailer park near on Nimbus Flat. There was going to be a general store with a motorboat rental, bait rental, and what else was there going to be? I think those were the main.
Was there a restaurant?
There was going to be a restaurant at the other end. The tour boat would go from one end to the restaurant at the other end. And I have a letter here that I think is about it's probably about a six or 7 page letter, 7 pages. But what happened was, this got to be more bizarre. First of all, I was able to get all of the using organizations. There was the Lake Natoma Rowing Club. There was the Huey of Hawaii, which is an outrigger group. There was the River City Paddlers. I think I got some of the running clubs involved. So we got this group to oppose it. And then fortunately, there were some elderberries out there. And during the EIR process, we pointed out the elderberries. And then we also hired John Holland, who was an attorney, who was the former president of SARA. And we raised something like $7,000 or $8,000, And that SARA was very, I was a member, I was on the SARA board, but SARA was not that actively involved in this. They only gave $300. But I kept reporting to SARA, gave information reports and so forth. And they were, of course, very supportive. And so we finally, after the 2 EIRs and the lawsuit, we were kind of still at a stalemate because the Parks Commission was still supportive of this. So anyway, and this is the part that is very unusual. I got a call from a fellow, and he said, "Are you Frank Cirill?" Yes. He said, "Well, I'd like to tell you about something." He says, "First of all, I'm president of the Folsom Chamber of Commerce." And he said, "Now, do you know that Bud Myers is going into bankruptcy, and so-and-so who owns the electrical firm he's being cited for non-payment of taxes and so forth." And he gave me all this information. He said, "What you should do is you should go down to the federal courthouse and you'll find all of this information is public knowledge. And this is the part that reads like a soap opera. I said, well, why are you telling me all of this? And he said, well, Bud Myers is dating my wife. So I said, thanks. I forget he was a retired officer from the Air Force. So anyway, I went down to the federal building, and I got all this information on Bud Myers. The corporation that he had founded, that he had formed rather, was a shell corporation. They never had any income, never made any disbursements or anything. Then suppose the $1 million backer, which was the electrical contractor, he was the one who hadn't been paying his taxes on his employees and so forth. So I got all of this information, and I figured this was the time to make my move. So I had this 7-page letter that I keep referring to. It was addressed to, it was dated May 10th, hand-delivered to Henry Agonia, Director, State of California Department of Parks and Recreation. And at that time, in a meeting previous to that, I had written this all in handwriting, had it all laid out, and I remember Don Alden, who was head of the Lake Natoma Rowing Association at that time. He and I went up, we were seated at the table, just he and I, and across was Agonia, McCargo, who was his deputy, a couple of the other staffs, and one attorney. And I said, I listened to them, and I said, they said, well, why are you opposing this? You know, we think it's a great thing. I said, well, I've done a lot of work on this over the past 3 years. And I've come up with something that I think you really should know about. So I actually read him the letter, and their eyes kept getting larger and larger and larger. So he said, and I said, you know, I haven't sent this letter yet, but I'm going to send it. And I think it was coming up before the commission in August. And I said, you know, I'm going to, he said, well, can I make a copy of that letter? I said, yes, you can make a copy, but I'm going to send this letter. And so I did, and I hand-delivered it to his office. Well, about a week after I hand-delivered it, and I didn't put it in the letter, but I also said this, you know, after, if you don't get this stopped, I said, and if it goes back to the commission, and they continue on, I'm gonna go to the Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. And I'm going to send them a copy of this letter and ask them to go. So anyway, about a week after I actually hand-delivered this letter, Les McCargo was his name. He was the deputy director. He called me up and says, Frank, he says, we are going to recommend to the Parks Commission on August, whatever it was, that they not go any further with this and they void the project. So I went there, and normally when I went before the commission, I used to bring a lot of people, but this time it was only Don Alden and myself. So they were very, very polite, and they said, we've reconsidered, Mr. Cirill, and we really appreciate what you've done a great public service, and that was it. So that was the result of about 3 years of concentrated effort on one thing, and that was the commercialization of the lake. And if you go out to the aquatic center now, beautiful facility, and then boating and waterways have built the area above, and they have the rowing regattas there. Well, if that had been turned over to the concessionaire, all of that would probably would not have been possible. So anyway, that was an effort that took about 3 years. So and that of course was going on. We're talking about 1988. That was going on when all of these other things were going on with East Bay Mud. And the reason why I bring that up to show that we had several significant issues to battle, and we had, and I have to say that, you know, SARA wasn't as I mean, we didn't have the membership base that we have now. We didn't have the financial backing that we have now. We didn't have Wanda. And in fact, on a lot of these letters, I retired from Continental Heller in 86. Previous to that, when there were letters regarding this or some other issues, because we didn't have a regular secretary, I used to have the secretary down at work type my letters, and I would take them out to lunch and give them a box of candy now and then. So that's how we got it. We were not as well, and this is before the electronic age too. I mean, everything was by phone, everything longhand. So things were totally different, and there's been a tremendous progress with SARA. You know, when you consider after me we have Alan Wade with a wonderful wordsmith, and now we got Warren, who's a great administrator. So we keep advancing all the time, which is to our benefit. So anyway, then let me see. The Fair Oaks Bluff. Now that was a significant. Now, the Fair Oaks Bluff again was a land issue. Just a bluff is what it was. And I was able to there work with a very with a very passionate group of people in the Fair Oaks area who wanted that bluff preserved, because the county parks department had always gone under the assumption that that was county property. But it was not county property. It was proven in court that the county only had the right of a road to be put across the bluff. So anyway, I started to work. I formed the Citizens to Save the Bluff were formed afterward by Marty Maskell and that other woman, I forget her name. But we formed Friends of the Fair Oaks Bluff. I always, you had to come up with a name. And in that issue, Sarah was very much involved. I was a director, and other people became involved. Jack Soule was involved, and Randy Smith became involved.
Betsy.
And Betsy really became involved at about halfway through. And so there we actually had to go to court. It had to be adjudicated in court, and the property, there was about 3 acres that had been bought by developers. One of them was an attorney, and Steve Godero was the principal person involved. And what we had to do is, after it was adjudicated in court, and we had very little money. We hired Samantha McCarthy. She lived in Davis, had just gotten married, and she was an attorney. Her husband was an attorney. Don Mooney was her husband, who later did some work for Sarah. But Samantha had never pleaded a case in court. And she took this on just for gas money and the lunches that I would provide for her. And very inexperienced. And we had on our side the county's attorney, and we had the Lands Commission. They were on the periphery though. And so we finally went to court, and I was one of the witnesses. And I remember the court case took about 3.5 weeks. And what was finally adjudicated was that SARA proved that we, through use, we had a right of about a swath of land right along the bluff. Oh, I'd say it was maybe anywhere from maybe 120 feet wide to about 130 or 40 along the bluff. The judge adjudicated that SARA had established that right for the public, and that was not owned by the developers. However, the developers owned the others, they owned the rest of the land, but it was still subject to be an open space. So they couldn't build on that land. Neither could the public legally use that, but the developers did gain another what we call a panhandle. Well, then what happened was then we got then we tried to get funds to purchase the property that the developers owned. And I remember the group, well, we got another group involved just to act as let's say, the money holder. And I forget who it is, but what that group was. But anyway, we began to raise money. The board put in about I think about $225,000, and that's when the county had more money. And then one of the persons whose property abutted the developer's property at Fair Oaks worked for Rayleigh's, and he approached Joseph Rayleigh Teal at that time, and we got, I think, something like 250 from him. And then we got, maybe 10,000 in donations from the general public. And then what happened was we convinced the owner that if the owner sold it to the county, why they could probably get some tax benefit. So Steve Godero primarily I think he sold it for like $1,010,000, something like that. Sold it. They had actually paid about $365,000, so they came out quite well, but it was in his favor. So as a result of all of this, and that was a community effort, the whole bluff, plus the area that was owned by the developers, became county property. And that's considered one of the best spots to look at the river in the whole parkway. They have weddings up there, they have funeral memorials, picnics up there, and so forth and so on. So that was a situation where I would say it was a classic example of the community, Fair Oaks community being involved, and others outside the community, because the bluffs was being used by everybody. But it took a long time. It took a very, very lengthy lawsuit, and fortunately we had an attorney, Samantha McCarthy, who only charges $40 a month. So that was, I think there was a lot of luck involved in that, getting the attorney and so forth. But also Don Mooney was advising his wife. We know that. So we got a very experienced, and I remember when we were down at the courthouse, Samantha was pregnant at that time with her firstborn, Megan, and she was an avid vegetarian. No fish, no meat, nothing. And so I used to buy her lunch, always had to take her to a vegetarian restaurant. And I remember one time we had come from the restaurant, and she looked at her clock, and she had to run back because she wanted to go to the law library. And here she was, about 3 or 4 months along, about like this, running back in those high heels, back to the courthouse. I said, oh God, if she ever falls, it would be a tragedy. But anyway, we won, but it was was a long process with a lot of people involved, and I was a portion of it, but there's a lot of other people involved who were very great contributors. So that was another situation.
Well, I think we had, do we have enough time for?
I have another one. I have another.
Okay, how much
40-minute
time do
one.
we have left on this?
Looks like it's doing really well right now, so.
Why don't we fit in, Frank, you served at one point when at least one of the parks directors was selected. Was it Gene Andel and Ron Suter both?
No, at that time it was even, I think, let's see, Gene Andal was just at the end of it. There was another fellow, I'll tell you, Don Nance was the director. He was the first African American director. He was actually an engineer. He was not a professional parks person.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, and I forget whose administration it was, they were reaching out to the minorities, and they got him to be a parks director. And then there was, and I think Gene Andal came after him. So this was all before Ron Suter.
And then but you did sit in on the interviews for Ron, is that correct?
Pardon?
You did sit in on the interviews for Ron Suter?
You know, I was supposed to. I remember Joe Smith was on that, and the other woman who was very, very much involved in ARNA, she's married to a physician, I forget her name, and I was supposed to be down there. The day that I was supposed to be there, I was in court for the Farrell's Bluff,
Huh. Okay.
so I was not.
Well, one thing that you did go through the whole process, and that was the UCAC for the latest plan update.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Were you involved in the 85 plan at all?
No, I was not involved in that plan, but I
But
was
this last
involved
one.
in all of the update of that. And that was I was Sarah's representative of that, and we had, of course, we had a lot of other people who were well known in Sarah. We had Katie Bagel, we had
Lou Heinrich,
Lou Heinrich, and we had,
Leah Brooks from Saba,
yeah, but we also had Peggy Berry.
Peggy Berry, right?
Yeah, and so we had a lot of friends on that. That was a good part. The bad part was that since there were 25 people on that, a lot of them didn't know anything about the parkway. Literally, I'd say almost 30 or 40% did not. So about the first four or 5 months, almost the first half year, they went through a learning process. I remember the fellow who represented Rancho Cordova, he was a rugby player. Why he was appointed, I'll never know. But he used to sit next to me, he says, Frank, he said, you know all about this? I said, yeah, I've been involved a long time. So they had a lot of people that really, unfortunately, didn't know anything about the parkway. And that's what made it very, very difficult. And the few that did, I must say, and amongst those that I've just mentioned, and sitting in the background, we had Elmer Aldrich and Bill Griffith, who'd been on the 85 plan. So they were almost like being on board. And at that time we had Ron Suter and Gary Cocola, and they were attending all the time. So, but that was a situation where it was very tedious.
Down to
Okay?
3 minutes.
3 minutes?
On this one, then I can switch it.
Okay. It was very difficult in that the procedure was that we had to practically vote on every single item, and it was very tedious, and there was plans that we had to be very careful that we got the right wording in the plan, but however, we did, the main thing that we were concerned about is off-leash dogs on the parkway. We were also concerned about road bikes, mountain bikes on the parkway, but we got that pretty well. We allowed it, but under certain strict conditions. But basically we wound up with a pretty good plan.
Mm.
And it was through a contribution of not only the experienced ones, but the inexperienced ones who were in a learning mode as they went along. And so that was significant, and that was that again, SARA was one of the main organizations involved, but there were all the others that were very helpful also.
Frank, why don't we pause right here and Deb can change the chip.